Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Friday afternoon webinar on PAS 2080, the carbon management in buildings and infrastructure specification. We will probably take around 40 or so minutes to do this webinar. You're able to ask questions using the questions box, which you should be able to see in your control panel. So feel free to type in questions as we go, and towards the end of the session I will happily answer them if I can, and we can just get cracking. So hopefully you can all see my screen okay. I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Director here at NQA. And between myself and my colleague Amber Dixon, we head up the NQA's Carbon and Sustainability Business Unit. So I've got a good 25 plus years these days experience around all things carbon and energy and environmental. And at NQA we have a team of carbon verifiers and sustainability assessors, and we're able to offer a wide range of projects. So NQA, for those of you that don't know, we're a global certification and verification body. We have UCAS accreditations for the work that we do. It's very much a global operation these days, but you can see in the top three in the UK box some of the carbon and sustainability certifications and verifications which we offer. So for example, ISO 14064-1 is a carbon quantification and reporting standard. PAS 2060 and ISO 14068-1 are the carbon neutrality verification standards, and PAS 2080 is obviously the specification that we're here to discuss today. We offer a range of ESG solutions at NQA, environmental, social and governance solutions under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see some of them there. So the learning objectives from this session, we just have a relatively short period of time for this webinar. PAS 2080 is fairly unusual and quite complex specification as well. So we're only going to be able to touch upon things at a very high level in this session. But we should be able to gain an overview of the basic principles and concepts of carbon management in buildings and infrastructure. We will have a high level look at the clause-based structure and the content, including the purpose of PAS 2080. And then we can think about how PAS 2080 helps to support environmental and sustainability ambitions. So I always think it's useful to be able to picture these things. So on the right hand side there, you can see the PAS 2080 standard itself. It was produced in 2023, this version. There was a previous version from 2016 before that. And if you don't have a copy already, it's fairly easy to find online how you can get a copy. So a little bit of background to PAS 2080 first. So what is PAS 2080? Well, it's a publicly available specification. So publicly available specifications generally are fast track standardization documents. So with an international ISO standard, these standards often take a period of many years to produce. PAS documents are publicly available specifications. Those are produced where there is a fast track demand amongst industry for the standardization of a particular specification. So that's how it's come about. There is a nice guidance document which you can see there, the guidance document for PAS 2080, which goes alongside the actual specification itself. And again, you can find that fairly easily just by searching online. PAS 2080 has been produced by a number of different organisations. The Construction Leadership Council were heavily involved, as were the Environment Agency, as well as some other private and public sector organisations which have a firm interest in infrastructure generally. So for example, Anglian Water as a utilities provider, National Highways who look after our highways, the Department for Transport, and some other construction companies and various other businesses have been involved in it as well. So again, if you don't already have a copy of the guidance document, that's a good thing to get a hold of. It helps to understand and interpret the requirements quite nicely. So who is PAS 2080 for? Well, it's for a variety of different businesses operating throughout the value chain with any big or small infrastructure project, and also buildings projects as well. So National Highways themselves, who look after all the roads, the bridges over the roads and so on in the country, have actually specified a requirement that all of their contractors and all of their subcontractors will have a PAS 2080 certified carbon management system by the end of 2025. The Construction Leadership Council have said something similar for their own members. So there's a bit of pressure on companies operating in this sector to organise their arrangements against PAS 2080 and to seek certification to that as well. So who does that impact upon? Well, it's the value chain that operates throughout the process of constructing and building these things. So construction companies themselves will be or likely to be involved with PAS 2080. Designers, so architects and engineers, are likely to be involved as well. Asset owners and managers, so the assets being the infrastructure or the building itself, are likely to also be involved, as are product and material suppliers. So that could be companies providing steel frames, timber frames, cement, any raw materials that's needed for the construction project. And PAS 2080 also mentions regulators and financiers. Although regulators and financiers are likely to have a strong interest in PAS 2080, it's unlikely that they themselves form part of the value chain and would therefore seek certification. Companies that we know are PAS 2080 certified at the minute. There's a whole and very rapidly growing number of them. The Lower Thames Crossing project, the HS2 project, private companies like Skanska and RPS, WSP, Amy Rambo, Keltry, Stantec, Aggregate Industries. So those organisations represent the different members of the value chain. There's construction companies in there, there's designers in there, there's asset owners and managers in there, and there's product and material suppliers in there. So PAS 2080 very much encourages collaboration between all the different stages of the value chain itself. So why use PAS 2080? Well, it's obviously related to the decarbonisation of the sector itself. So according to the UK government's figures, around 40% of UK carbon emissions are linked to the built environment. So it's important that the sector itself aims to decarbonise, and PAS 2080 is a great tool for assisting with that. There's other commercial advantages as well, obviously emission reductions and cost saving opportunities through reductions in material, energy and labour. The commercial advantages around tendering and being able to respond to tenders and providing consistency in the industry and throughout the supply chain. Marketing and brand image and reputation type advantages come from it as well. But I think the key one, because of the nature of the specification, where it very much encourages collaboration throughout the supply chain, there's likely to be a kind of snowball effect, whereby if one company achieves PAS 2080, then there's requirements in there which we can discuss later on around the supply chain procurement activities that are required in PAS 2080, and therefore the knock-on effects onto members of that supply chain, contractors, subcontractors, and so on. So next we'll have a look at the breakdown of PAS 2080 itself. So it's a clause-based standard or clause-based specification. For those of you that are familiar with ISO standards generally, you'll recognise clauses 1, 2 and 3, the scope, the normative references and the terms and definitions. Clause 4 lays out some high-level decarbonisation principles, and then the real kind of nitty-gritty of the requirements themselves that are required for certification to PAS 2080 really begin at clause 5, where we look at leadership. Clause 6 is about integrating the carbon management into the decision-making process in the infrastructure and the building projects. Clause 7 is the whole life carbon assessment principles. In other words, that's a clause where we begin to look about quantifying the carbon and managing the carbon. And then clause 8 is about setting targets and establishing baselines so you can monitor performance and improve. Clause 9 is about monitoring and reporting. And clause 10 is an interesting clause, a standalone procurement clause around the value chain and the expectations around the appointment of members of that value chain by others. Clause 11 is around continual improvement, and clause 12 covers the claims of conformity. So there's 3 different ways that a company can claim conformity to PAS 2080, and those are laid out in clause 12. We shouldn't forget about the annexes as well. There's 3 very useful annexes in the specification. Annex A is got a really useful set of tables in there which help with the categorization of greenhouse gas emissions and the removals to aid with the decision-making process. So that ties into clauses 6 and 7 nicely. Annex B has got some really useful tables as well, actually, about applying the carbon management process itself. And Annex C provides guidance, but that guidance is intended for government regulators and financiers. If you're looking for guidance for the implementation and the design of a PAS 2080 system, the guidance document you can lay your hands on is probably the best way to do that. So we'll go through the clauses one by one. Scope and normative references we're familiar with, I guess, so we don't need to dwell too much on them. But the terms and definitions clause is well worth a read in detail if it is something that you find yourself under pressure to adopt PAS 2080. So we don't have an extensive list here because the actual list itself is very long, but there's some really interesting terms and definitions to think about within PAS 2080. Some of the ones we might discuss, infrastructure. What do we actually mean by infrastructure? Well, the UK National Infrastructure Plan 2014 defines what PAS 2080 means by infrastructure. So transport, energy, so power stations, for example, water, so water supply and wastewater treatment plants, for example, waste management facilities, and the communications sectors are what PAS 2080 means by infrastructure. Direct influence is also worth discussing because PAS 2080 uses the terminology around control and influence very frequently. So the levels of control and influence that any one organisation has over the decarbonisation process is critical to PAS 2080. Direct influence is where the asset owners and managers have the ability to use enablers to encourage users to make low carbon decisions. End of life as well is worth thinking about. So the specification is not just about the concept, the design and the build and the operational stage of any piece of infrastructure or building, it also requires considerations around the end of life. So what happens at the end of the asset's design life? Is it ready for refurbishment, for retrofit, for disposal, for dismantling, etc.? And all of that comes into this thinking about the whole life carbon, whole life cycle carbon process. Some other terms and definitions in there as well. Operational carbon is an interesting one. So that's about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the operation of the infrastructure itself to allow it to be able to operate and deliver its service. So the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the use of the building or the infrastructure during its lifetime. System boundary is an interesting one and an absolutely critical one, because this is where you're actually setting the boundaries and establishing a set of criteria to specify the life cycle, the spatial and the temporal extent of the greenhouse gas quantification of the management system. User carbon is also a very interesting one, because that one's about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the user's utilization of the infrastructure of the building and the service it provides during operation. So if you think about that, you know, if we're talking about a highway or a road, for example, the users of that road would be you and I in our cars perhaps, and the user carbon relates to our use of that piece of infrastructure. In other words, our use of our cars. So it extends a long way, this specification. Value chain is absolutely critical to understand. So throughout the rest of the clauses of PAS 2080, it splits the requirements out into which of the value chain members each requirement applies to. Some of the requirements apply to all of the value chain members. Some of the requirements only apply to one or two or more of the value chain members. So bear in mind, when we're talking about value chain members, we're specifying that as the asset owners and managers, the designers, the constructors, and the product and material suppliers make up the value chain. Whole life cycle carbon emissions is worth a brief mention as well. So that's the sum of the greenhouse gas emissions from all stages of the life cycle of the product or asset, and within the specified system boundaries themselves as well. So because we're talking whole life cycle carbon emissions, we really need to be thinking about carbon emissions from the concept stage, the influence, the control and influence over those, all the way through the build and the operation, right through to the end of life. And those whole life cycle carbon emissions all need to be considered. And because of that whole life cycle carbon approach, that's the reason why the value chain is so important, because the value chain represents the members which from the concept all the way through to the end of life stage of the infrastructure of the building itself. So a brief overview of Clause 4. Clause 4's relating to decarbonisation principles. It's really focused on managing that whole life carbon which is under the control or the influence of each member of the value chain. It's got a really good diagram in there as well, which helps with establishing the boundaries around the control and influence side of things. So a nice diagram in there that can help you to interpret the requirement. It's about aligning to net zero requirements as well. So the UK government, of course, have a statutory commitment to achieving net zero within national boundaries by 2050, and PAS 2080 and the infrastructure and building sector generally has a big part to play in that. It's about applying the carbon reduction hierarchy as well. So there's a detail in PAS 2080 around the carbon reduction hierarchy and the best ways to tackle that. There's a diagram in clause 4 as well around the ability to reduce whole life carbon at different stages of the hierarchy. So as you can imagine, at the concept and the design stage of any project, the ability to reduce the whole life carbon is very high, whereas by the time you get to the use and the end of life management of the asset, the ability to reduce the whole life carbon is very low. And clause 4 also talks about the implementation of the governance around the project or the program itself. So clause 4 really lays out the decarbonisation principles. Clause 5 focuses on leadership, so this is relatively straightforward enough, I think. It's the first clause, and this happens in a few of the subsequent clauses as well, where the requirements within the clause it starts off with a paragraph where the requirements apply to all value chain members, and then subsequent paragraphs split out the requirements for each individual value chain members. And that's common throughout quite a lot of PAS 2080 clauses. So leadership includes, the usual providing resource, commitment, all that type of thing, but it also necessitates the need to challenge current practices and also to foster collaboration as well amongst the different value chain members. So leadership, absolutely essential clause of the specification itself. Clause 6 is around integrating carbon management into decision making, and again this clause starts off with requirements that apply to all the value chain members, and then it splits out the requirements across individual value chain members thereafter. Clause 6 is around identifying the levels of control and influence that each value chain member has, and then using those control and influence levels, establishing a carbon management process overall. So it's really about making sure that the decarbonisation aims and the carbon management itself is integrated into the decision-making process when it comes to designing, constructing and dismantling the infrastructure and the building. Clause 7 is about the whole life carbon assessment principles to support decision making. So this is about assessing the greenhouse gas emissions at this stage. So we assess the greenhouse gas emissions over the whole life cycle to help to inform that decision making process. Clause 7 applies to all the value chain members, not individually, but to them all. So essentially it's about setting boundaries so that you've got a boundary within which to quantify the carbon emissions. It's about actually assessing those greenhouse gas emissions themselves, thinking about various things, including control and influence, but also the level of accuracy and the level of detail that is possible for those greenhouse gas emissions. It also asks us to think about land use changes. So, if we're building on a greenfield site or a brownfield site, then the land use change and the related impact on greenhouse gases as a result of that. It has a nice diagram in there of the level of detail and data that's available over time. So that increases over time over the life cycle of the project versus the ability to reduce the whole life carbon over that same timeline, which decreases over the time. So there's a nice diagram in there which aids with the understanding of the requirement. Interestingly, PAS 2080 it's not a tool in itself for quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, what it asks you to do is to select a methodology. It references various existing ISO life cycle analysis standards, for example, for civil engineering projects or for construction projects. but it doesn't tell you exactly which ones to use. So it's your choice which methodology you use to actually quantify the carbon. PAS 2080 doesn't provide us with a tool to do that. Instead, it refers us to other standards for doing so. Clause 8 is about target settings and establishing baselines. So the baseline is defined as the scenario for what carbon emissions and removals would have been in the absence of planned measures aiming to reduce those emissions. So we can establish the baseline, and then once we've got the baseline established and we've quantified the carbon in clause 7, then we can then go about setting targets for improvement. And it encourages smart target settings, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. It's usually the targets in any one project, or the GHG reduction targets, that is, they're usually set by the asset owner or the asset manager, and then subsequently adopted by all the members of the value chain itself. So because of that, you know, the asset owner and the manager, which is often the customer, they set the targets, and then they encourage or require the different value chain members throughout the value chain to adopt the same targets themselves. And again, with clause 8, we've got this pattern where the requirements are set out for all value chain members, and then they're split from there on into the requirements for each individual value chain member as time goes on as well. Clause 9 is about monitoring and reporting. So relatively straightforward, this clause. Again, it sets out the requirements for all of the value chain members and then splits into individual value chain member requirements. But it is about, you know, setting things like establishing roles and responsibilities for monitoring and reporting, for establishing the monitoring and reporting mechanisms themselves, but also for sharing the outcomes of the monitoring and reporting processes with the other value chain members. So it just kind of reflective of the collaborative nature of this specification throughout the value chain itself. PAS 2080 doesn't really work for you know, just one value chain member doing anything about it. It really requires that collaboration throughout the value chain. Clause 10 is a standalone procurement clause. So it's quite an unusual clause in that it, you know, it requires the establishment of contractual terms which are aimed at supporting the asset owner or the asset manager's decarbonisation aims. So it's about developing procurement categories within tender documentation for selecting suppliers. So the asset owner or manager will establish procurement categories when they send tenders out to, for example, the designers, the constructors, and the product and material suppliers. And in that way, PAS 2080, when I described it earlier as having a kind of snowball effect, it very much works in that way, where the asset owner or manager cascades the PAS 2080 requirements down through the value chain via the procurement and via the tender process. It also requires a high degree of engagement within the value chain, so back to the collaboration and engagement requirements. And as you might expect for the procurement clause, because of the nature of these construction projects, the requirements are laid out per value chain member, so individual requirements for each value chain member rather than requirements for all the value chain members. Clause 11 is around improvement or continual improvement. This looks at, you know, the input, the engagement, the assessment, the review all aimed at leading to improvement, which ultimately leads to the end goal of the decarbonisation targets. Again, it's laid out with a clause for all value chain members, and then it splits out into clauses for each individual value chain member thereafter. And then the last clause is clause 12, which is around claims of conformity. So PAS 2080, you can there's 3 different mechanisms by which any company can claim that they're conformant to the requirements of PAS 2080. And there's a hierarchy here as well. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, there is a mechanism built into the specification where you can self-validate as conforming to the requirements PAS 2080. Part of the requirements around the self-validation is to produce a documentation pack to evidence that you are conforming with PAS 2080. So if you do go down that route, it's likely that you'll be asked to produce that document pack and also produce your own self-validation records. Higher up the hierarchy is other party validation. So that would be somebody like perhaps a second party consultant who would be able to provide validation of the conformity to PAS 2080. Again, a documentation pack's required for submission to potential customers to evidence that. And then at the top of the hierarchy for claims of conformity is independent third-party certification via a certification body or a verification body like NQA. And that involves, many of you, I suppose, are familiar with other ISO standards. So it involves external third-party certification, usually across, perhaps a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit, and then ultimately results in the issue of a certificate which demonstrates your conformity to PAS 2080. And in the case of independent third-party certification, it's the certificate that the customers are interested in without having to provide the document packs as evidence thereafter. So how to go about achieving PAS 2080 certification? Any value chain member can seek independent third-party certification to PAS 2080. NQA provide that service. The certification process that we operate to involves a stage 1 audit, which is usually a relatively short duration audit. And the purpose of the stage 1 audit is really a gap analysis to make sure that there's no major gaps that are going to cause any problems when it comes to the stage 2 audit. Make sure all the documents are in order, make sure all the methodologies are correct, and make sure all the requirements are being accounted for. And then after the stage 1 audit, we do a stage 2 audit, which is about testing the implementation of the system. That tends to be a longer duration audit, and the output from that, all being well, is the issue of a PAS 2080 certificate. And that certificate, certainly with NQA, lasts for a period of 3 years before the need for a recertification audit, and it involves another surveillance audit for each of the years in between as well. There's lots of tools and resources available on our website. We have a much more comprehensive e-learning program around PAS 2080. We also operate our associate partner program. So if you find that you need a consultant to help you with PAS 2080, we can provide you with the names of 3 different consultants from our associate partnership program who have got strong experience of the construction industry and PAS 2080. And there's lots of other materials, case studies, blogs, various other bits and pieces on our sustainability microsite that would help you with the PAS 2080 process overall. So just to finish off and summarise the key learnings then, at a very high level, we've run through the structure, the content and the purpose of PAS 2080. We've looked at some of the drivers for it and what the outlook looks like in terms of PAS 2080. We've understood some of the fundamental principles and concepts around the carbon management, and had a think about how PAS 2080 can help to support environmental and sustainability ambitions. So that brings us to the end of this. If anybody has any questions, then please feel free to type them into the chat box there. So I will just extend this slightly to see if I can. So Breadju's asking, can someone share a PDF copy of PAS 2080 here to download, or a link? PAS 2080, I think, Breadju, is freely available, or it certainly was. So you can find it online if you search for it. The Construction Leadership Council, I think, is the link to use. But certainly if you search, you should be able to find it online and download a copy for yourself. Emma's asking, could we have an estimated percentage that we should add to the total capital costs in order to plan, implement and monitor PAS 2080 and get certified? Too difficult to say in this forum, Emma. I think I would need more information to be able to answer that. Sorry, Julia. I would probably need more information to be able to answer that, but I will ask my colleague Amber to send you some information out after this, which will help to be able to answer that question for you. No worries, thanks. Okay, does anybody have any last questions? Nope, it doesn't look like it. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Hopefully that's been of some use. As I said at the start of the session, PAS 2080 is quite an unusual specification. It's kind of half management system and procedures and half carbon quantification and reporting, which is quite unusual, all bundled into one specification. But it is, in my opinion, an excellent specification with all the right intentions at heart. And whilst it may be a little bit daunting thinking about the design and the implementation of it, there's lots and lots of good practice, including on our website out there, that should help you with the process. Great stuff. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining, and wishing you all a lovely weekend. Thanks very much.